Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us.
and some of the vegans in my department were horrified that I would let my disgust stand in the way. I actually no longer find it disgusting, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that kind of launched this whole research project. And I do think that if you look at media coverage of lab-grown meat, there's very much a focus on the yuck factor. So to the extent that people have an objection to this technology, I think that the media has really cashed it out in these terms. And it's not just the media. There's a lot of, there are a number of studies about people's reactions being informed by this kind of ick factor or disgust. And so one way of understanding our reaction here is just like, it's discussed and people are disgusted by it, and we have to see whether that will ultimately be an obstacle. I think there are a number of reasons why a kind of yuck factor is not enough to serve as the basis for rejection. I think that historically, the things that we have had this reaction to, a kind of like yuck, disgust reaction, have ended up getting adopted. And when we look back, our disgust seems kind of misplaced and maybe a little embarrassing, right? So if you look back at, I was going to say 20 years, but I guess it's like 40 years now, to the 80s, when like in vitro fertilization first breaks into the mainstream consciousness, there's a lot of articles in even philosophy journals being like, well, this is very unnatural. And, there's a kind of yuck factor. People use the term yuck factor and talk about like the kind of creepiness and unnaturalness of this technology. Now that just seems like incredibly dated, right? And this is just something that we accept in our everyday practice. If you look at the history of like, frozen meat, people are like, whoa, it's frozen and now we're going to cook it and eat it. That seems so freaky, right? So I think that we can't really distrust our disgust reaction. I think that we also know disgust is highly malleable. It's culturally variable, right? So you can find very similar headlines talking about eating insects, but we know that eating insects is a practice that is only disgusting to a relatively small subset of the world's population and is kind of historically relatively recent, right? It's not, Aristotle talks about eating cicadas at one point and when in the breeding cycle you should eat them. So our disgust at entomophagy is like a relatively recent and culturally local artifact. So if disgust is the basis for this reaction, then I don't think really it's something we should put too much weight on. But I wonder if there's more to our discomfort with lab-grown meat than disgust, and that's the question I want to explore. So there's a passage that I think articulates a different kind of non-yuck-based discomfort from a book by the journalist Larissa Zimberoff called Technically Food, where she asks the reader to imagine a future where school kids are touring like cultivated meat plants. And she says, imagine standing there with your inquisitive 8-year-old trying to explain the massive steel tanks and what's in them. It could be an exciting conversation. Scientists have figured out a way to grow meat in tanks. Or it could be a message of warning. Many years ago, we used to eat animals. Maybe next door to the factory, she says, there could be a tiny farm for kids to visit with like ducks and pigs and sheep. Of course, someday we might also have to explain to our children what a farm was, that once, long ago, we used to grow our food outdoors on the land. If you're like me, this last sentence sounds kind of ominous, right? And maybe a little sad and might seem to express a kind of reservation about this future. It doesn't sound like unfettered optimism to me. And I don't think the author intends it to sound that way. So then the question is like, what is wrong with the picture that's getting described here? And I think that as philosophers, there are 3 options for where we can locate this wrongness and try to explain the discomfort that last sentence makes us feel. The first 2 are the first option is that our discomfort here is located in an ethical objection to lab-grown meat. That there's either like, it's degrading our social values, it's bad for animals, it's bad for us, right? It somehow degrades our character. I'm going to focus mostly on the ethical arguments that are like rooted in animal ethics, which is what philosophers have focused on the most in these discussions. The second kind of way we might try to cash this out is in terms of a metaphysical objection, like there's lab-grown meat is bad because it's not really food, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then the third would involve an epistemic objection, like it's bad for our capacity to know what we're eating. And I'll say more about each of these. I'm going to start by unpacking this metaphysical critique. So this is the idea that lab-grown meat is bad, or makes us, our objection to it is that it is somehow not really food or not really meat, right? And here there's a picture. The picture on the bottom here is taken from a Facebook post by the group Forks Over Knives, which is like a plant-based eating advocacy group, and I think Netflix documentary, where they say it may be plant-based, but something that costs millions of dollars to develop in a lab isn't a health food, right? So this is the idea that like plant-based burgers aren't really burgers, they're not health food. There's a recent book that came out, I think, over the summer called Ultra Processed People. And here you can see like the idea that it's not just that like our food isn't really food or our meat isn't really meat. It's that somehow this trickles into us, right? And now we are no longer like the same. And so there's this worry about like what we're eating. But I think the problem here is that this seems to assume that like food and meat have definitions, that there's some definition of like what food is, and lab-grown meat departs from it, right? And I just don't think that's how the concept of food works. I think Sophia has some really interesting work on like the way that concepts evolve and modify and are changed and kind of take on different meanings. I'll come back to this later in the talk. But I think even if that's true, right, and even if it were the case that we had some definition, some fixed definition of food, and lab-grown meat were like a departure from it, we still need an explanation of like, why is that bad? Because concepts change all the time, or terms get used differently. What's the problem here, right? So I think, well, this may be one expression of our discomfort. It doesn't really explain it. Okay. What about ethical critiques? And here I have to apologize because, like, as a moral philosopher who teaches, moral theory, I feel bad that I'm about to run through these so quickly. But I want to, I have a lot of ground that I want to cover. I'm happy to answer questions about any of these in the discussion period. This is, I think, where most of the discussion in the philosophy literature of lab-grown meat has focused, is in ethical arguments, right? So I've divided them up into two types here. The first are arguments or objections to lab-grown meat based on animal rights issues or concerns. And the second are what we might call consequentialist objections based on considerations involving like animal welfare or animal suffering. So in the first camp, we find objections like, look, lab-grown meat is bad because it reifies these problematic species hierarchies, right? Even if it doesn't involve eating actual actual animals, right? It reinforces this idea that animal flesh is something to be consumed. And in doing so, it reinforces the idea that humans are somehow elevated above animals. There are replies to this objection, some inventive ones involving the idea of cultivating human flesh and eating it. I think ultimately this objection doesn't work for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Additionally, we find worries that lab-grown meat is somehow disrespectful to animals or disrespectful to nature overall. Okay, on the other hand, we find consequentialist critiques about animal suffering. Some of the objections that have been discussed here are the idea that lab-grown meat will somehow displace happy meat or happy animals, right? Like, well, there are a lot of animals out there being raised for food that have relatively good lives. And if we shift to lab-grown meat, those animals won't exist or they won't have good lives. And so there'll be like a reduction in animal welfare for those animals. Some people have proposed like, well, we could still keep sort of like show farms around. And I know there was one company that recently had a pitch that involved like, well, we're going to go to farms where there are like animals living in really nice conditions and we'll build the bioreactors there. So you'll have like the farm out front, you can grow it right on the farm, right? So this idea of like, we'll address it that way. And then a second concern that consequentialists have raised is like, well, lab-grown meat still uses cells from animals, so it still involves some degree of animal suffering. And you can kind of see this also, this worry about using animals echoes this worry about it being disrespectful to animals. So for those moral philosophers in the audience, you can see this as a kind of Kantian worry about like, well, it's using animals as a means, but you can also see it as like a utilitarian worry about animal suffering. Okay, I know that was quick and I apologize, but let me say why I think the ethical objections here are not super promising. Oh, and I should also say that if anyone would like references, please feel free to email me. I'm basing some of this discussion on a recent book by the philosopher Josh Milburn. There's also a paper by Julian Savulescu, who does applied ethics, that some of these objections get discussed in more fully. The problem here, I think, is simply that factory farming, industrial, large-scale animal agriculture is so bad, right, that it's going to be really hard to mount a compelling ethical challenge when the alternative is factory farming. Certainly for a consequentialist or utilitarian whose primary interest is in reducing animal suffering, anything that promises to replace factory farming just has an enormous presumption in its favor, right? Because the scale of factory farming is so vast that it's going to be really hard to tip the calculus against it. Even if several hundreds of cows have to suffer through biopsies, right? That's nothing in the face of like the cows suffering for our current meat production practices, right? So I think that the problem with ethical arguments is, on the one hand, we have this amount of suffering, this current practice that is so bad, right, that anything that promises to end it is going to have a huge moral presumption in its favor. Another point I want to make before we move on from the ethical critiques is just that there are different ways to think about what we want morally, what moral outcome we want here, or what our goal is, right? When we're talking about lab-grown meat. And I think we should distinguish a few different goals we might have. The first is to reduce animal suffering. The second is to restore and respect, the second is to respect animal rights, maybe to restore animal rights, to recognize animal rights. And I think that lab-grown meat makes a compelling argument that it can do both of those things insofar as it replaces factory farming. But there's another goal we might have when we think about what we want from our food system, which involves making us more ethical, informed, and autonomous eaters. And that is not the same thing as A and B, right? I think that lab-grown meat can make a compelling case that it can do A and that it can do B. But the question is, can it do this third thing? And that's really the question that I want to move forward with. Okay, so where are we at this point? I think we have seen that the ethical and moral critique, I mean, maybe I've made this case too quickly, almost certainly I have, but I've argued that the ethical and moral critique does not succeed and is unlikely to succeed as long as the alternative is factory farming. I have argued that the metaphysical critique, while I think it raises some interesting points about conceptual change, doesn't ultimately have the normative underpinnings it would need in order to serve as a critique. So I want to focus the remainder of the talk on this idea of an epistemic critique, that our discomfort with lab-grown meat comes from its effects on us in our capacity as knowers, as producers of knowledge, and as creatures that ultimately seek to develop and share knowledge. And I think that if this critique can be made good, it opens up a new conceptual repertoire for philosophical discussions of lab-grown meat. But, and this is something I probably won't have time to talk about today, I think it can also be extended to think about other forms of industrial agriculture and ultra-processed food as well. And that's part of the bigger picture project that I'm trying to develop. So let me say more about what I mean by this. There is a lot we could say here. I have not been keeping track of time, so I don't know, but I'm going to focus on two aspects here. The first involves epistemic injustice and the idea that lab-grown meat might be bad because of the way it exacerbates inequalities between knowers or inequalities between forms of knowledge that are based on prejudice or bias. And the second avenue we might pursue here is the idea that lab-grown meat represents or somehow advances a type of manufactured ignorance, right? And I'll say more about what I mean by both of these in a moment. Okay, so what is epistemic injustice? Sorry, excuse me. This is a topic, as some of you might know, that has gotten a lot of attention in the philosophy literature in the last 10 or 15 years, starting with Miranda Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice. Ironically, feminist philosophers have been talking about epistemic injustice much longer than that, but it's only recently that mainstream analytic philosophy discovered the concept. Okay, so epistemic injustice can happen in a number of ways. Most fundamentally, it involves wronging people in their capacity as knowers, right? The idea that part of what we are, part of what makes us the kinds of creatures that we are, is that we seek to know things. We both individually and collectively develop knowledge, develop resources for finding out knowledge, for sharing and disseminating knowledge. And that in that capacity, we can be wronged, injustices can be done against us. One way this happens is when we allow racial, gender, ethnic, or other forms of prejudice or bias to affect our assessments of people's testimony or contributions, right? This is sometimes called testimonial injustice. And the idea here is that, you know, the kinds of biases we walk around with can affect how we assess other people in an epistemic capacity, whether we hear them, whether we treat them as credible, whether we like give them space to share their contributions, right? So you can think of cases where someone's like, oh, like stop being so emotional when a woman gets like complains about something, right? Oh, you're just being so emotional and moody, or you're such an angry Black woman, or something like that, where we don't take what they're saying seriously because of a prejudice we have against their identity. That would be a form of epistemic injustice. And it's important to say, like, epistemic injustice can cluster alongside other forms of injustice too. In fact, in like the case I've just described, right, there are any number of injustices that track like racial and gender identity. Epistemic injustice is one form, but recognizing it might mean recognizing that there are specific remedies we take. Okay, another way this can happen is when we deny people the opportunity to develop and exercise their epistemic skills, right? Sometimes because we don't want to listen to them or hear them or grant them the status of expert. And then we also sometimes deny people the conceptual resources they need to make sense of their experiences or communicate their experiences, right? When we simply don't like recognize certain things as real, or we don't talk about certain things as a society or as a culture, when we never bother to develop the vocabulary for certain things, we might be denying people the resources they need to share their experiences and therefore to make sense of them. Okay, so I think when we talk about food and epistemic injustice, there are some questions that we can see emerging, right? One involves like whose goals, whose interests are driving the development and innovation in our food systems, right? When we talk about like, oh, the market for X or the market of Y, who do we have in mind? Who does the market refer to, and who's left out of that conversation, right? When we talk about what the consumer wants, whose wants are we thinking of there? And I think it's also important to recognize, you know, this is often discussed as if there's like a fixed set of consumer wants and then the market is simply responding to them. But of course, our wants and desires and tastes are also, you know, shaped and influenced by the way things are marketed to us and the products that are made available to us, right? I've been reading Dan Saladino's book, Eating to Extinction, and he talks about like sour citrus and how in a lot of places sourness is a taste that's really like sought out, but the development of orange juice as many Americans' primary source of citrus, like changed how oranges were bred to make them much sweeter, and people really lose their taste for sourness. So it's not that we have some intrinsic desire for like super sweet citrus, it's that other market forces. Anyway, I'm getting off into an orange tangent. I'm here to talk about meat, so we can come back to that later if you want. A second kind of question is like whose knowledge is valued and which traditions are worth preserving, right? So when we talk about like what kinds of meat people want, again, like whose culinary traditions are we looking at? Whose culinary traditions are we kind of striving to preserve, and which parts of those traditions. And then lastly, whose expertise is valued here? Whose testimony is listened to and whose testimony is dismissed? Charlotte Biltikoff has a book that came out recently, and it's open access. So if you're interested, you should definitely, you can download an open access copy electronically, called Real Food, Real Facts. And she argues that the debate over processed food has really been shaped by the food industry in such a way that to be anti-processed food is to be anti-science in a fundamental way, right? So like food science is processed food, and processed food is food made by science. And if you oppose it, then you are essentially anti-science in a way that shows that like you don't really understand all the facts around it, right? If that's true, that kind of systematically sets up the dialectic in a way that discredits a certain kind of view, like from the get-go, and doesn't really let it get off the ground. Because if you're anti-science, like you don't really, why would we listen to you, right? You're just kind of, allied with all of these other views that we might think like don't bear any attention, right? Okay. When we talk about manufactured ignorance, what I have in mind, I think, is really represented nicely by this quote from a scholar named Robert Proctor. And his work actually comes out of work with tobacco companies in the 80s, or I guess earlier than the 80s, but tobacco companies as they worked to debunk a link between smoking and lung cancer. And so his work was on showing how they would create doubt about the studies linking smoking to cancer by sort of finding experts who would not say that there wasn't a link, right? But just create enough uncertainty to suggest that like maybe the link was in doubt. And he says the focus here is on ignorance or doubt or uncertainty as something that is made, maintained, and manipulated by means of certain arts and sciences. And he goes on, this is an idea insufficiently explored by philosophers, that ignorance should not be viewed as a simple omission or gap, but rather as an active production. Ignorance can be actively engineered as part of a deliberate plan, right? So the idea here is like, ignorance can be very strategic. And if we create doubt, we can shift the discussion to meet our own ends. But I think also, and perhaps more relevant for our purposes today, ignorance can be something that happens as a result of other choices that we make. And in the course of highlighting certain features of a situation, we might also obscure and create ignorance about other features. And that the kind of ignorance that we might be making in the food system might not be made for such nefarious ends as like that manufactured by the tobacco companies, although in many cases now the tobacco companies and food manufacturers are the same companies, right? And are literally using the same playbook, but also that as we pursue certain technologies, other technologies that might themselves embody a kind of knowledge will be left by the wayside, right? So I think a couple of more specific questions we can ask here is, when we set up the discussion in such a way that lab-grown meat is presented as the alternative to factory farming, what gets left out of that dichotomy? What options are we not considering? What are we not discussing, right? There's a long history of plant-based eating. It's not like people have always eaten in a way that emphasizes meat or puts meat at the forefront of a plate. So when we talk about the idea that like, well, there's this increasing desire for meat and we have to meet consumer demand, and the only ways to do it are factory farming or lab-grown meat, right? We're leaving out a whole stretch of history. We're leaving out a whole set of other practices, right? That might also, feed people, including entomophagy. And then this book, No Meat Required, is by the food writer Alicia Kennedy, who kind of traces the history of plant-based eating back thousands of years, but also like the vegan and vegetarian movements of the early 20th century, to highlight that like, well before plant-based meats, there was a long and rich culinary tradition of eating without meat, right? So there's this question about like, who are we leaving out of the discussion here? What histories are we not attending to? when the concept of meat is re-engineered, whose interests are served here? Whose concept is this, right? And again, I'm not like, I don't think there's like some natural kind meat that we have to be loyal to. I think there's plenty of room for concepts to shift and change. And I think Sophia has done some really interesting work on the way that these concepts can shift and the concept of meat in particular. But I do think that right now, the concepts of meat and milk and egg and dairy are literally being litigated, at least in the US, by corporations. And I think it's important to pay attention to make sure that when we re-engineer our concepts, they're being re-engineered like from the ground up and not from the top down. I also think it's important to note what histories and what labor and what practices and traditions are erased when concepts change. And, you know, Sophia has coined this phrase that I really like called original ignorance. And I think this also comes up a lot in, I've noticed that this comes up in discussions of flavor. So my son and his friends will often be like eating candy. And just the other day, one of them was like, this grape flavor doesn't even taste like grapes. It doesn't taste like grapes at all. And I was like, that's because you haven't had the right kind of grapes. So I like bought them some Concord grapes and I was like, this is what grape flavor is supposed to taste like. And it was like, they just didn't have any contact with the food that this flavor was supposed to be imitating, right? Likewise, we might lose touch with the source of our concepts or the origins of those concepts and thereby be missing an important insight, as I think sometimes happens with things like plant-based eating maybe now. You can tell a similar flavor story about banana, as some of you probably already know, but that's a different topic. Okay, to continue with this theme of ignorance, I think that people's food traditions, and here I have in mind not just the product, right? Notice how lab-grown meat is heavily focused on like the sameness of the product. But in many cases, it's not just the product, but the process of food that embodies and communicates identity. So here we have a picture of from the Instagram feed of the activist and scholar Winona LaDuke, who's an Ashkenazi activist, a member of the Ashkenazi, and here they're harvesting menumen, wild rice. And she says, this wild rice is a way of telling the world who we are, right? The wild rice tells the world who these people are, right? It's part of their identity as a people. And this is a way of preserving both cultural and epistemic diversity, right? So there's really, you know, the rituals and the processes of harvesting and curing this rice. It's a highly social process, right? It embodies a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of, you know, I don't have time to go into all the details, but I would encourage you to look into it. But a lot of our food traditions embody knowledge in the process. And I think that part of the problem here, and this is a problem for philosophers and not a problem for, you know, I'm not saying it's a problem for people, for the practitioners, is that this is, in many cases, this way of thinking about knowledge is alien to the kind of Western analytic philosophy way that we think about knowledge, right? That philosophers think about knowledge as a kind of propositional statement of knowers as these kinds of atomistic individuals. So if you think to like the Cartesian, you know, coming out of the Cartesian epistemic tradition, where knowledge is something you get by like closing your eyes and like going deep into your own head and reflecting, right? Yes, if I watch some people like going out to harvest wild rice and I say, look at all that knowledge, that may seem kind of like, wait, that's not what knowledge looks like. Knowledge happens somewhere else, right? But in fact, that's only one narrow view of what knowledge is. Likewise, you know, it might seem strange to say like, oh, this rice tells the world who we are, right? As a philosopher, you might be tempted to read that as kind of like a metaphor or a figure of speech. But I would argue that epistemic justice requires that if that's what people say, we take that testimony seriously, right? If people see a food production ritual or see a process of gathering or hunting or slaughtering food as expressing their identity, then I think we take that testimony seriously, right? and don't just discredit it because it doesn't necessarily look like the concept of identity or the concept of knowledge that we inherit in our philosophical tradition. Okay. There's also, and I think I'll just say too before I move on, because I'm almost done. Sorry, I'm almost done. I realize I'm going maybe a little long. That the anthropologist Joe Henrich has really interesting work on like cultural rituals around food as technologies and the way in which these rituals embody knowledge that may not be able to be articulated by any of the practitioners, but that nonetheless is an important kind of knowledge. And he thinks that sometimes these rituals function in such a way that the opacity of that knowledge is an important part of it, right? If, for example, the way you prepare like cassava, you have to prepare it a certain way, otherwise it will be toxic. And if people really understood the reasoning behind the ritual, they might be tempted to tinker with it. But if you make it a kind of taboo, then no one will function with it. No one will tinker with it, right? People will perform it exactly the same way every time. So by kind of making it a ritual that people don't necessarily know the reason why they're performing, they're actually less likely to tinker with it. And it's kind of preserved over time. So there may be forms of knowledge that no one necessarily has access to individually, but that collectively we transmit through time, right? And I think here, I won't go through this slide all the way because I'm going to try to wrap up. We can see an analogy with something like seed diversity. When we start farming monocultures and seed diversity is lost, we lose potentially helpful adaptations that would help us navigate things like climate change, disease, things like that, right? The diversity of seeds makes for a more robust agricultural system overall. And I think we can say something similar about epistemic diversity, right? A diversity of ways of gathering, preparing food makes for a more robust food system overall, right? Because it gives us options when it comes time to navigate challenges. Monocultures are weaker and less resilient. Okay. And I think that, I've been talking about wild rice and you might think I've gotten kind of off the topic of lab-grown meat, but I think that when we see it in this context, lab-grown meat starts to look less like a radical alternative to factory farming and more like the next step in the logical progression of industrial agriculture. I don't think it has to be. And I'm going to try to end like by, on a more optimistic note, but I do want to highlight that I think this system of industrial agriculture is a kind of epistemic trap, right? It occludes alternative belief systems. This is a concept I'm borrowing from the philosopher T. Nguyen, who's written about playfulness and epistemic traps, right? So it kind of discourages us from exploring alternative belief systems by being like, let's be realistic. We have factory farming or lab-grown meat. Which one do we want to choose? And I think that is a kind of trap, and I think we should resist it. There's a really nice quote from Benjamin Wargraff's book, Meat Planet, where he talks about cultured meat as springing from a form of imaginative arbitrage. He says, our inability to think seriously about changing our food system through collective action and political will encourages us to turn to technology and the market for solutions. An entire industry may spring up out of an impoverished sense of possibility. I think this is right, except I think the word inability is unfair. I think we are actively discouraged from thinking seriously because it's portrayed, that kind of idea of political action and change, I think is made to seem kind of silly, right? And we're made to think well, look, be serious. It's either factory farming or this other alternative. And I would just highlight, as I wrap up, that I think also there's a sense in which lab-grown meat is now offered to us as more of the same, as this incredibly safe, when it started, people were like, whoa, this is so weird. And I think now it's really being pitched to us as this is very safe, right? What's exciting about the prospect of cultivated meat is it doesn't require you to change. The meat can be similar to what you've had in the past if it's right into your lifestyle, but it gives you a sense you're making a choice that's better for the world. This is from the CEO of a COO of one of the cultivated meat companies. You can see a similar thing happen with, cricket protein bars, right? We're just going to fit this into your existing eating patterns. Don't change. Don't think too much about it. Just know that we're giving you a better alternative. And I think that, you know, I'll kind of wrap up with this quote from Alicia Kennedy. I won't read the whole thing, but she's talking about, like, you know, we know what the planet needs. We know what people need. And instead, we're getting steaks made in a lab by people who don't really care about how people eat or cook or why people love food. She says meat maintains its central role because people can't imagine another way forward. And I want to end by just, like, my final slide, that point about imagination, because I don't want the takeaway to be like, I am anti-tech, right? I am anti-future. I want to go back. And I think that, you know, we should go back to traditional food ways to save the world. I do think there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in traditional food ways. But really, I want the takeaway to be that the future we imagine for our food systems and the improvements we want to see in our food system should be driven as much by imagination and play and creativity as by ethical imperatives and our sense of what people are willing to accept. I think concepts of epistemic justice and agency offer philosophers and others, I hope, a new conceptual repertoire or vocabulary with which to formulate concerns about the food system and desiderata on a fair food system. And I think that we should strive to give people credit and credit people's willingness to experiment, to play, to embrace new foods, and to really get excited about a food future that isn't just more of the same. So thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you.
Should I stop sharing my screen? Can you see? I don't even know if you can see me. I'm so used to Zoom, so.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can stop sharing screen.
Okay, and then if people want to go back to a slide, they can just tell me and I'll bring it back up. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex, for this wonderful talk. So engaging and rich. And I'm impressed with what you managed to do in this time.
I'm sorry, I forgot to time myself, so I hope I didn't go too long.
It was really, it's really good. And we did start a few minutes late, so we can go a little bit over time, hopefully. So I'm not sure if other people would like to start. Maybe I leave the floor for our participants, or I'll have a look if we have any hands. I see a hand up from Helios, but I'm not sure, and Agisilaos. I'm not sure who put their hand up first. Shall we start with Agisila? Agisila, you want to start? And then Helios can go afterwards. And feel free to turn your camera on as well, if that's a possibility for you.
I tried it earlier when entering. It wasn't connecting properly, so
okay.
Yeah, mic worked. Yeah, you responded, so yeah, it works. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting. I'm interested in climate justice and the growth, so I have a question about emissions. So if we think that our ultimate goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as fast as possible, so scale matters and speed matters in the sense that how soon we do it really plays an important role. And if we say that we have two strategies, one is to, if we think that the industrial animal farming and agriculture plays an important role in greenhouse gas emissions, which strategy do you think is more effective? One is to try to move away from the current traditional system and go to lab-grown meat, or the other strategy would be to try to explain to people what's wrong with meat consumption and try to explain them that it's important to transition towards a vegetarian or vegan diet. Which, in regards to greenhouse gas emissions, which strategy do you think would be more effective and sooner?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. And I think I'm showing my age a little bit because when I started working on these things, people were talking more about the animal ethics side of it. And my experience with students is that climate has really become much more of motivation in these discussions. As far as soonest, I think that convincing people to move to a vegetarian or vegan diet is the quickest strategy. And that's based partly on my experience teaching students for the last 10 years that is a concern. Climate is a concern that really moves people and can really change people's food habits. And we have alternatives now, right? We have vegetables now. You can be a vegetarian right now. I worry that lab-grown meat is promising us something to discourage us from like making any significant changes now, because like it's going to be fine. We figured it out and we're going to get there. Like it's going to be okay, right? Now I know there are also conflicting studies about the climate impact and the emissions impact of like bioreactors to produce cultivated meat. I am not qualified to like assess the credibility of those studies, but I will say this is another place where we see that strategy of manufactured ignorance really coming into play. And in my class, I teach an article about a program run and funded by the beef industry in the US, where they offer a degree called an MBA, which for those of you who don't know is like there's a very prestigious business degree called a Master's of Business Administration. This is a master's in beef advocacy. So they have students coming to their program, getting an MBA, and then they teach you talking points about the beef industry to like help combat worries about the climate impacts of beef. So there's a lot of manufactured ignorance here, right? And I think that, but yeah, and so that's why I think that this debate is going to go on, and it's going to be in some ways a sideshow as long as the beef industry is engaged in it. But what we know for certain now is that you can be a vegetarian, right? Or you can be a vegan. And so in that sense, I think, yeah, people should not be waiting for cultivated meat. Yeah. And I would also point out that a lot of the companies investing in cultivated meat are also the people producing like chicken and beef now in these conventional ways. So it's not clear that the industries will even be two separate industries.
Wow, yeah. I see last sentence a wow in the chat when you talked about that. So
I know.
Share the wow.
It's unbelievable.
But yeah, shall we go to Helios? I see a hand up. Thank you.
So I found this discussion very interesting. I found your points very convincing, and thank you for your presentation. So I wanted to share a perspective, maybe a different perspective. I have been like 5 years vegetarian, and then I'm now continuing on 11 years vegan, and on the young and plus I'm like really healthy, like I'm a world-class athlete. So I wanted to contribute my perspective on the yuck factor. I find lab-grown meat personally disgusting, but that's because it reminds me of meat too much. Like I find plant-based sausages disgusting for this reason. So our qualia are not universal. Not everybody feels the same things. The same way. And yeah, it's probably easier to convince people to become vegetarian or vegan, either through the climate arguments or through the ethical arguments. But in my experience, all these years, like now 16 years, having discussed with people, because they say now it's this time it's like it's not a regular case because this is our discussion. But they say vegans will tell you they're vegan, like they bring it up all the time. But
right.
I don't in my life. Like few people know it. But other people will tell me, like, why aren't you ordering meat? Why aren't you eating that?
I'm just listening.
And then they will open this discussion, and then we have conversation. Like they try to convince me to eating meat again, and convince me that I'm wrong for not consuming animal products. And I have found that even though you can convince them in an argument, like maybe they don't have a better argument, maybe they will even agree with you that you're right. People don't do what they think is right. People think that it's wrong to litter. People think that it's wrong to pollute. And unfortunately, my experience in that is that, and I'm going to conclude with this because I've taken too long now. My experience in that is that people are alienated with philosophy and moral arguments and arguments in general. People don't care so much what even they say is right or wrong.
So yeah, I think that's you brought up a number of really interesting points. The point about disgust at plant-based meat imitations. I mean, I think that's a really good point too. And there's a question about like, are those products serving, right? I have a friend who's been a vegan for a really long time, and he's not interested in burgers, right? Like that's not what he wants to eat. I think though part of it is like there's a heavy social component, and as you point out, there's a heavy emotional component to what we eat. And the littering example is interesting because another thing that we know about social norms is people's performance and adherence to them is based partly on what they see other people doing, right? So this can cut both ways, because one worry might be like, well, if you bring in some, cultivated meat into the system, even if that has a lower climate impact, it's still reinforcing the social role of meat, and that will kind of, keep people continuing to eat meat. The question of how to get people to go vegan or vegetarian, I agree that arguments, and I think this is a super interesting question about like strategic elements. I think arguments tend to not move people that much, and it's a bit of a mystery, right? Like every year my students come in and they're like, I've read all this stuff. I totally agree. It is true. I still had meat for dinner last night. And they're confused by it. They're like, why is this happening? Am I bad? And I'm like, I've been teaching this for 10 years. So you're not bad. It's understandable. I think part of it is just like our social environment, right? It partly determines what we do and what we see people around us doing and what's available and what's kind of like the norm for us socially. But we also know that people's ideas about food can change and can change quite dramatically. And one example is like when you think about foods that people used to never eat, like sushi, right, would have been a really bizarre concept to people. And when it first came on the scene, it was really, there's this thought of like, how are we going to market this stuff to people? And we have to really play up its normalcy, right? We have to put crickets in protein bars. We have to make lab grown meat into nuggets. But when sushi came on the scene, right, that's not how it got adopted widely. It got adopted by being like, this is what really adventurous, sophisticated urbanites are going to go to restaurants and eat. And now in my supermarket in my small town, I can buy sushi every day, right? It's just there in the refrigerator case. So I think that there are different strategies we can use, and I think it doesn't have to be all one route. There's historical precedents, both for kind of like, I guess you could say organic changes in people's food preferences. And then there's also been like concerted attempts to change people's food preferences. Like in World War II, there was a committee to study food habits that was helmed by Margaret Mead and Kurt Lewin, like two huge anthropologists, social psychologists, trying to get US eaters to eat more organ meats. Because in the US, people wanted steaks and chops, but we had to send the steaks and chops to the troops. So how do you shift people's habits? So there's a whole like, I have a short public piece coming out on this, but there's a history of like changing people's food attempts. It turns out like arguing at people doesn't really work because it makes them think like, I should be eating this way. But that's not how people want to approach food. People want to approach food like, hey, do you want to try something really cool and exciting and different? And when you look at how people did start to eat organ meats, at least in my generation, it was like hipsters like in Brooklyn, like being like, I'm going to eat this tongue on my charcuterie board because it's cool and makes me kind of edgy, right? So I think there are a number of strategies. Philosophers like a single answer. We like one answer, but that's not how it's going to work in the case of food. It's going to be a multi-pronged approach. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to check if we have more hands up from our audience.
Can I ask one question to Alex, Sophia? Yes,
please.
Alex, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You at one point you juxtapose the lab meat to let's say more local practice, food production and food processing, and I'm wondering whether or where pastoralism and different system
Yeah.
of meat
Absolutely.
production
Yeah.
in your argument, whether and how it fits, because pastoralism is meat production and meat consumption, but on a different scale, different mode of production, different engagement of the producer with the environment, with the animal, with the connection of animal and human, but still it has slaughtering. It has all these
Absolutely. Yeah.
practices that are related to meat production. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and absolutely, I think pastoralism is the word I was looking for. Pastoralism is the idea that belongs in this discussion. I think that there's a number of things to say there. I think you're right. It represents a lifestyle, a culture, a tradition that we find all over the world, and I think that and in a different version, if I had more time, one of the examples I was going to go into is like caribou hunting, which is an example that Henrik talks about in his book, and the way that people kind of organize their caribou hunts is really interesting. But for the sake of time, I will say, I think one criticism we sometimes hear, or one argument we sometimes hear for like lab-grown meat is like, well, look, sure, it would be nice if everyone could just eat meat that was like raised on local farms or raised by, in a pastoral system, but there's not enough of that to feed the world, right? There's not enough to meet the demand for meat. So, okay, again, there we see that false dichotomy. There are, options that involve like reducing demand and continuing to eat certain kinds of meat, right? But the idea that like, well, that can never feed the existing demand for meat, as if the existing demand for meat is like a mountain that's out there in the world that just exists independently of what, it's not. It's a manufactured demand. It's a demand that's driven by the expansion of like Western diets and, Western-based fast food and processed food industries. And that I think, and also I think it has to do with the association of like meat and status, which I think at least in certain parts of the US, like where I live, the kind of meat that comes from pastoral systems is a very high status kind of meat, right? So I think we also know that like considerations of status and what people value are themselves malleable, right? And are themselves things that we can change. So I think we can change demand. We can change what kind of meat there is demand for. And I think that this narrative that those things are fixed and that, well, people have to have KFC or people have to have quarter pounders, so pastoralism can never be the answer, that's a false narrative. And I think, it's pretty clear whose interests it serves. So I think that that's kind of the like cynical, here's the marketing issue answer. And then I think the other answer that is maybe also motivating your question is like, do those pastoral systems represent the kinds of knowledge that I'm talking about and that I'm describing and that are threatened by industrial agriculture? And there the answer is like, absolutely yes. And it's not just the practices relating to the animals, but an entire way of organizing a community and a society that is also lost there. And that I think we may not, and part of the reason I didn't include it is because I'm not even in a position to say like what specifically is the knowledge there, right? I know that Sophia has some papers. Sophia sent me some papers early on about like Sami herding and slaughtering practices, right? And it's really interesting. And that's just one case of one group of one way of relating to animals. And so then the question is, what else is out there and what else has already been lost and is being lost that we don't even know about? And I think the analogy with like seed diversity and crop diversity is really meant to be taken strongly there. Because once those things are lost, they may be lost forever. Like we can't get them back. We don't have the equivalent of a seed bank for those kinds of practices.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Alex. So interesting. I'm just gonna pitch in really quickly because I know we are a little bit over time, but yeah, I really enjoyed the argument and your exposition. It was very thought-provoking. I noticed you were. I have a few questions, smaller, bigger. I'll just list them, and we can keep talking as well. So
Yeah.
I noticed you were using manufactured ignorance, and there's also this concept of strategic ignorance, which I think is also nice. And I was wondering if you had like consciously chosen that one over the other one. That's a small question, maybe not so important.
So the answer is no, it wasn't conscious.
No. Okay. Good.
I should be more careful. I should be more conscious.
No,
and
no,
careful.
no. Both are out there. I think temporally it was Proctor. I mean, he did really grow this field of agnotology, but I think the concept of Magoya on strategic ignorance is a little bit better in the sense that it shows that it's strategic. It's manufactured for a reason.
Right.
So it could be, could be it's not only manufactured, it's also strategic or kind of calculated in specific ways. And so that's something. And on the epistemic diversity and the how much knowledge we're losing, I was also thinking we are also losing metaphysics and ethics. So on the diversity argument, like we're also losing the ways in which people could relate to animals as significant, or all these kind of metaphysical concepts as well of who is alive, for example, or what is alive. So that was just a note once we comes with, because of course it's a kind of, I don't know what kind of injustice we would call it, because it is epistemic injustice, but at the same time it spans this kind of other levels as well. So that's kind of, I don't know, I just thought about it.
But can I say something quickly to that point, because I don't want to forget, but I think, and what we lose there is not just knowledge of the alternatives themselves, but knowledge that there are alternatives. And maybe this is where the injustice comes in, is that we're left with the impression that this is the only way, right? When even if we don't necessarily like embrace any of those alternatives for ourselves, the knowledge that ours is just one way among many is it's a really important piece of knowledge to have, and allows us to recognize and imagine other possibilities. And I think like I was using as a computer lift a book by David Graeber, like that big book, The Dawn of Everything. And he's really into this, like, when we think about political systems, we have to recognize that like you can consciously recognize the contingency of your political system and even set out to re-engineer it. So anyway, I think that's a really good point, that we might lose knowledge of the contingency of our social, ethical, and metaphysical arrangements.
And one point, like on the argument, I was wondering whether your argument extends to also plant-based meat replacements, and what you think about that. I think it might actually also extend to plant-based meat replacements, and I was wondering about that. Like on some level, in my view, and like plant-based meat, I don't know if they're less evil, but it's in some ways they're out there. I don't know if from a pragmatic point of view, one might say they're doing some work towards meat reduction. And so for people like all of us who are never completely morally good, because we can't, I mean, like we want to help. I mean, like now driving to Athens, we saw at least like 2 stray dogs, and I didn't stop to help the stray dogs. Like there was a part of me that's like, it's all these moral dilemmas where you should help or you should do something, but for various reasons you don't, and you tell yourself you can't, but you can often, or so, in some ways could some sort of techno fixing be pragmatically sort of justified, even though it is creating a kind of like entrenchment of familiar forms and like modes of consumption and cooking and shopping and all these things. I mean, ideally, we would be back to legumes or back to, I mean, appreciating a lot of these plant-based proteins, which though involve a lot more work in terms of cooking or more patience in some ways, but they can also be so flavorful and wonderful. And like, now that I'm in Greece for the last few months, I'm, it's so good,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think so. I'm really glad that you asked this question because I actually want to go further than plant-based meat. And I think I alluded to this at one point. This started as a project about ultra-processed foods because really the discomfort that I have and the intuition that I'm really wondering if I can vindicate is this intuition that there's something wrong with ultra processed food. But a lot of times that gets expressed in this very moralistic way by people like Alice Waters and Michael Pollan, who are like, oh, eat real food. Like, what are you doing? That's not, you've become this ultra processed person. And so what I really wanted to do was explore possible routes to objections to ultra processed food, and which definitely includes plant-based meats. And so I think that if this line of argument, like the bigger picture project that I alluded to, I would ultimately like to sort of cover all of that. And I think ultra processed food is interesting too, because it doesn't start out with that yuck factor, right? Like you don't have that yuck factor when you open a bag of Doritos. You don't have that yuck factor when you eat
no, you have the yum factor, actually.
You have the yum factor, and that's the problem, right? And so I think that that's in some ways a more challenging case to make. Yeah. About the technofix point, I mean, this is where I guess I'm being a little waffly at the end, because I don't want to say oh, technology is always bad. I do want to acknowledge that ultra processed food is not going anywhere, right? But I do think that we can grant that and still maintain our discomfort with it. We can grant that and still sort of push back on it and critique it. And, sometimes when I've had this conversation with people, they are like, oh, what do you think? We're just all going to eat locally grown organic food? And the answer is no, nobody really thinks that, right? But the fact that that option is there, again, reminds us of the existence of alternatives and lets us imagine alternative food systems. And just the act of imagining that can let us see what's wrong with our current system and hopefully make improvements, even if they're only incremental, right? But when we lose the ability to imagine alternatives, I think we lose the will to agitate for improvements.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think it's such a complex issue, if you think against women kind of coming out of these roles of tending to animals, tending to farms and going in the workplace. And then you're it's very complicated. It feels like changing the food system would change the world, really, on a fundamental
level. And it has, right? And I think that the food system portrays it the food system or the food industry likes to paint a picture where they are responding to changes in the world, right? We're responding to these changes of what people want, but there's less, I think, attention paid to the way in which they're driving what people want and they are driving the changes. And that new technologies can really have these knock-on social consequences that we might not foresee. But yeah, it's incredibly complicated. And I wonder if, the other part of this project I didn't really talk about is philosophers who care about epistemology, please care about food, because there's so much epistemology here. And food is our first experience of epistemology, of knowing what to eat. And, I wonder if one reason that philosophers haven't done more with food in these areas is that we like things that are simple and admit of a clean conceptual analysis, and food is not like that. Food is very challenging in that way. And so, yeah, that's my other, but I figured you don't need to be convinced that food is important. I'll save that part of the project for when I do talks to analytic philosophers who don't know about food already. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, Stathi. Yeah. I don't know if you want
Thank you so much. That was really great, Alexandra. We are really grateful to you. And that was an exciting talk. Thank you. And look forward to listen about you and your fascinating work. And with this, I would like to thank you all for being here this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you in the next Go Just webinar. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Alex, once more. We are really grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
No,
Bye.
wonderful. Thank you.
Bye.
You.
Bye-bye.
Bye.